is incredibly important for the state of Colorado. And one of the issues we have to face is how do we accomplish the best regulatory environment possible and at the same time provide Coloradans with the best and most effective 911 program. And I'm very pleased that our staff and Linda Toriani has been doing a tremendous amount of thought on this. And Mr. Toriani, unless Commissioner Tarver, Commissioner Patton would have some comments, we'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Chairman and Commissioners, and I would just like to welcome everybody to the room. This is actually a tremendous turnout from the 911 stakeholder community. And so with that, I am going to give my very upfront disclaimer here that the true experts are the people in the room behind me, not me. And so given that, in putting this presentation together, I was able to use a lot of material that other folks had already put together. So all of this information is not original, it's not mine. I hope that I gave the appropriate credits on the slides where they're due. And certainly there is so much activity on Next Gen 911 and so many different options and paths that can be taken that what I am presenting today is going to be very high level. It's going to give overviews. It's certainly not the only way to think about next generation 911, but hopefully it gives enough of an idea of what's all encompassed in it and is thoughtful in what are the considerations that this commission and the stakeholders in the 911 community need to be working on for Colorado going forward. So with that, I'll get started unless you have any questions. Okay, the outline that I was taking today is basically to present the history, get a little bit into an overview of E911, which is our environment today, and Next Gen 911, briefly identify the stakeholders, talk about some key Next Gen 911 principles that we need to be considering, talk about I can't remember if it's 4 or 5 main building block areas that need to be flushed out for Next Gen 911. Present what has been done at the federal, and when I say state of Colorado, that's state and local, what's been done to date for Next Gen 911 activities and exploring what needs to be done in Next Gen 911, and then a brief conclusion. So please stop me at any time if you have any questions. So the first 2 slides are the fun slides, and then it gets a little more complicated. But just to give the brief history of 911, the concept of emergency service came about in 1937 in Great Britain. And in the United States in 1967, President Johnson's Commission on Law Enforcement and Administration of Criminal Justice first recommended a national uniform 3-digit emergency number. And so AT&T, being the owner of all things telephone at that time, adopted 911 as that 3-digit emergency number. The first 911 system was implemented in Haleyville, Alabama that following year. And then it wasn't basic 911 service at that time, voice only, and the caller had to provide all the information so that they knew where and how and what to do with the call. In the 1980s, technological advancements enabled the implementation of what we all refer to as E911. So that's where you got caller location information being, and the number being delivered automatically, enabling the accurate routing of calls to the right public safety answering points with attendant information that then the person didn't necessarily have to be able to provide it in the call conversation. Skip forward to 1996. That's when wireless calls, 911 calls, first began being received just as a 7-digit phone number into what we call PSAP administrative lines, PSAP public service answering point. In 1998, that's when the FCC required a 2-phase wireless implementation of E911. The phase 1 being calls received with tower location and the cell phone number. Phase 2 being more specific location information, either via latitude and longitude, either via a GPS capability in your handset or otherwise through a triangulation technique. I couldn't tell you the specific counties. By and large, Colorado is wireless phase 2 compliant in most areas, although I think there's a very handful of outlying areas that don't have it right now. It's about the 2005 timeframe, that's with IP telephony and other IP-based services coming about in the telecom sector. That's when we started to think about and realize some of the real challenges that were coming along for public safety and 911 based on IP technology, and what opportunities it also brought. So I'm going to stop there until we talk more about what IP is, and then we'll come back to what's been done later on. Okay, so on Colorado's side, pre the 1980s, and way back, basic 911 was provided by Mountain Bell, kind of on a call forwarding basis. In 1981, Colorado's first authorizing 911 statute allowed governing bodies to assess monthly 911 surcharges on landline customers. Skip forward a decade, in 1991, a formal complaint at the commission triggered a rulemaking proceeding and formalized the structure we have today with the basic emergency service provider, which is CenturyLink, and it also put in place at the request of the 911 authorities the establishment of a statewide advisory task force. This is really the point in time in which we were able in the state of Colorado to put in place a cost-effective and efficient statewide E911 system. Average the costs for across the state for putting in place this service, and really enabled some of the rural carriers to have effective E911 services. In 1997, there was a Senate bill that implemented a surcharge on wireless devices, so they were also contributing to the cost of 911. In 1997, some additional loan program enabled a further build out to 38 rural communities. In 2006, due to a settlement in another docket, the Colorado 911 Resource Center was established, and Daryl Branson, who you've heard from before, is the executive director of the Colorado Resource Center, and provides assistance to 911 authorities and PSAPs, acting as a clearinghouse for information at the national, state, and local issues, coordinates training, just does a tremendous amount of work to help have a forum to bring together the needs of our 58 individual 911 authorities and their PSAPs. And I know you're familiar with this because 911 is a local, very much a local authority structure. There needs to be a way to come together to work on issues like Next Gen 911 and other things. And so the task force as well as the resource center play a critical role in bringing that together. In 2007, a complaint by Adams County 911 triggered work on a complete cost restructure of our E911 tariff that's filed at the commission. A lot of work, good work done by a lot of folks, including CenturyLink, and has resulted in over a $7 million annual savings to our PSAPs. And then in 2010, another Senate bill passed that assessed 911 surcharges on prepaid wireless service. So that brings you current to what's happened and up to the point of IP. So on the next slide, just at a very high level, what's the difference between current 911 and NG911? Currently, you have voice calls with limited data. So you can get the calling number and the caller location for switch circuit, VoIP, and wireless calls to the public safety answering points. In the future, the goal is all current voice capabilities, plus better and more useful forms of information. So we've all heard about it, text, images, video, from any networked communications device for delivery to PSAPs, first responders, or other critical emergency entities. In addition to that, because of the structure of the technology, it creates the opportunity for increased reliability of service in terms of redundancy and redundant paths out there for what I label here as interconnection to other jurisdictions for mutual aid and assistance, and maximizing the use of available capital and operations costs. So really, you can start thinking about, is consolidation of PSAPs appropriate? Is consolidation of operations or backup operations across different entities appropriate? And it could go so far in the grand scheme of, being able to communicate and pass along information anywhere nationwide, really, through this. If information is important to have and come in, the goal is that these networks are interconnected to a degree that you can get the information wherever you need to get it to. Better enabling emergency responses at national, state, and local levels. So that's the ultimate goal. Will take a long time to get there, but that's what the technology and the networks will enable. So now I'm going to back up, and Daryl Branson at our Colorado 911 Resource Center put together a very, very, very high-level simplified presentation of how the call flow happens in the current 911 system, and then I'll overlay how that might happen in a next-gen 911 system. So if you start with a landline caller, and I'm going to move through these slides fairly quickly, there's a lot of them. Essentially, the call is routed to a central office that's part of the local exchange carrier's facility. So that's the customer picking up their phone, dialing 911, and going through their carrier. A wireless caller, similar thing. The call comes into a cell tower and network, and then that call gets similarly shipped over to that mobile switching center, the wireless version of the central office. A VoIP caller is going to be coming through an IP-based network to a VoIP positioning center, again, to a central office. The different industries use different labels for their switches for their technology, so I just caution everybody and not to get hung up on how some of these are labeled. We're using fairly generic terms for us. So at the end of the day, that call comes into the central office, and then it's routed over trunks to what we call a selective router database. That's its point of entry into that 911 network that CenturyLink, as the basic emergency services provider, provides out to all the PSAPs. The SRDB determines which 911 call center or PSAP should receive the call and routes it appropriately. So the caller's phone number is included with the call, and that's what we refer to as ANI, or automatic number identification. That's transmitted via analog modems to a database that returns the address and the subscriber information for the caller through an automatic location identification, or ALI. So our friends in the current world are the selective router, ANI, and ALI. So at that point, the public safety answering point has the information it's need. The PSAP processes the call and then relays the information to the appropriate emergency responders. Sometimes if the call is, if you live where I live and you're going down beautiful South Sheridan, and it might be Denver jurisdiction or it might be Jefferson County jurisdiction, it may be that call needs to be transferred over to another call center before the dispatch happens. So then the emergency responders get out there and respond to the emergency. So just shifting over now to a next-gen 911 system, and again, I'll caution, this is highly, highly simplified because there are many different ways to implement next-gen 911 and the transition. But for a number of states and a number of architectures for moving to next-gen 911, it's anticipated that the beginning and the end of the call may still be in an analog format. So the call starts as it always starts, coming from a landline, a wireless, or a VoIP carrier to that central office. Will be shipped into what we call a legacy network gateway. in this case, it's made out of wrought iron, but I'll show you the next charts that make that a little more sophisticated. Routed through what we call emergency call routing function, that in this particular transition is a replacement of the routing, the old selective router database and the ALI database. Converted back to analog through a legacy PSAP gateway. Comes down to the public safety answering point. Oops. We just lost my slideshow.
Mr. Matoriani, while you're looking that up,
Sure.
the ECRF, is this going to be a new large capital expenditure to replace the previous program, the SRDB?
It will actually be many large capital expenditures, and so after we go through this set of slides, I'll show you a little more complicated picture. I'm not going to go through the details of it, but you'll see the transition and what's going to get put in place. And yes, all of those component parts will be new. There will be capital and operating expenses associated with them. So let me see if I can get this. There we go. So then once you shift over from those, sending it through and transitioning back and forth through a legacy network gateway, ultimately the goal is you have the entire network be an IP-based network, both for that basic emergency service provider piece, the calls coming in, as well as the IP technology and databases and applications and services that will need to be resident over in the PSAP to be able to handle all of the different forms of IP calls and information coming in. So it's envisioned that at some point, voice will come through, images, video recordings, SMS, other kinds of texting, vehicle telematics like the OnStars and others, and that will all then be coordinated through an IP-based network, one or many IP-based networks, and we'll talk about that, over to the public safety answering points, who then can provide and get to the emergency responders. Again, this is oversimplified, and some of the issues that we'll talk about a little bit later really will get into, do things come through the network or go directly to the PSAPs? Do they go directly to emergency responders? Do they go there at all? And what are some of the issues around it? So this particular diagram shows it all coming in through an IP-based 911 network, but that network could be many component parts, direct or indirect, over to a PSAP or an emergency responder. So that was the really simple view. This is the really complicated view. And again, there's probably, I bet I saw 100 different diagrams out there somewhere on a website that gave you a current and a next generation 911 architecture. This particular one.
Before you go to this next sample current architecture, going back to your previous slide, you made the comment about this IP-based 911 network could be many different formats. Who should be making that decision? Is this going to be a decision that's made by the 911 community? Is it a decision, since CenturyLink has predominant role? Is this a decision the legislature makes? Is this evolutionary?
Okay, I think evolutionary is a great word. It actually, given that we don't in the state of Colorado have a designated statewide 911 entity that is responsible for making that decision and putting it into place and funding it and putting in place all the rules around it. My opinion is that it is actually the entire stakeholder community here is going to need to come together, and it will involve carriers, it will involve our 911 authorities, it will involve the commission, and it may involve the federal government and the legislature. But as we figure out what is as best we can and hopefully gain consensus on what is the right statewide plan, we'll know at that point that any one piece of it or many pieces of it are best addressed by the commission through potentially a rulemaking, or the legislature because we want to put in place a new funding mechanism, or by each individual 911 authority because they're the ones with the responsibility and oversight for anything that goes directly into their 911 centers. So I think in Colorado, it's going to be a mix of all of the above. And what we're hoping is that through the administrative docket here and the work that's already been done today, that all the stakeholders can come together and have a very structured forum to get these answers. So.
No, that's a great explanation. I guess the only other question before I let you proceed is, as I understand it, we have a vast variety of 911 providers. We've got small, as Commissioner Pat will tell us, rural telecoms, rural communities versus large metropolitan areas with disparate resources. You're envisioning that this process would be the one to pay attention to everybody's concerns?
Yes, and in a few more slides, I identify some key Next Gen 911 principles, some of which were already worked on by this stakeholder community, and one of them addresses exactly what you're asking.
Thank you.
So I won't go through these slides, but I just wanted to kind of give a pictorial view of what is really behind the simplified slides that you just saw. So again, this is the legacy network. It involves the legacy call origination, what's the equivalent of our VESP, and then over to the right, the PSAP side of the world. So, and then all the databases that are needed to be accessed. So that's today's architecture. And if I look at tomorrow's architecture, it gets a bit more complicated with the IP call origination, an IP network, the Next Gen 911 network, and a Next Gen 911 PSAP environment. So that's the future view. And this would be the transition view. So the only reason I put up these slides, and it's certainly not the only way that this can be implemented, but this gives you, I think, an idea of why it takes all the stakeholders, why it takes all the vendors, the telecom providers and everything to really come together to figure out and say, we really think this is the best way to go in the state and what our transition needs to be. And these are the very real component parts that will be existing as we traverse through this transition from the current 911 to Next Gen 911. And I'll leave it at that unless you're dying to ask questions about any of the specifics in any of these charts.
I probably shouldn't go here. I was doing just fine until we got to the sample final and the sample transitional. And I understand, Linda, this is sample. You're just trying to illustrate how difficult it is and how incremental it needs to be. But is it fair to say that sample final, there's none of the legacy is left, none of the
There's no legacy from our telecom providers. So in other words, they've transitioned all their networks. CenturyLink has abandoned the public switch telephone network and now is all IP. To our 911 infrastructure is all IP. To the PSAPs are completely IP. So it is truly an ultimate end goal. So we will be living in the transitional world for a while, at least from the standpoint of needing to deal with legacy type calls coming in, as well as for a while. And I wouldn't expect that the PSAPs would all transition at the same time and at the same rate. So there's going to be a mix of this, and how quickly you can get where is just going to depend on a lot of funding and other issues.
And given that those few outlying areas you were talking about haven't gotten to E911, this for a while is
right.
How long would for a while?
I don't know, that might be a question better asked of, as some of maybe the PSAP or the authorities get up here and speak, or some of the telecom providers, because they're the ones who know. And I think Gary Kluge's in the audience, and he dealt with the original, at the commission, transition over to E911, and maybe he could speak to how long that took. But it certainly is multiple years. Okay, I'm gonna go out on a limb and say over the next decade.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so who are the stakeholders in this process? It's our local 911 authorities, including the PSAPs, state patrol, first responders, other local government agencies, telecom providers, our basic emergency services providers, different areas of state government, our consumers, there's equipment providers, applications providers. There's a lot of new entities in this new environment, given that you've got new services and you're able to connect to more points and share information across more points. So that just broadens the stakeholder base. Okay, so I mentioned before that I was going to talk about some key principles. There was a study that was commissioned by the task force and the 911 Resource Center, and used a consultant mission critical partners to go out and really survey our current environment and look at what was available for Next Gen 911 and give some recommendations. This was done, I believe, in 2011. As part of that, when they were out there talking with the task force and all the stakeholders, these are the key principles that were input to them and that they felt like were critical for the state to pay attention to. So I think they do, there may be more, but they do form a good basis for what we need to keep coming back to and make sure that we're achieving as we go through any decisions on implementation and transition. So the first one being the consumer must be able to access emergency services from all their current devices or any other device that the consumer could reasonably expect to be able to access 911 services. And that doesn't mean all this has to be implemented at the same time, but that's kind of the goal of putting in place Next Gen 911. And that 911 service must be able to connect through the end user's carrier or provider. And if you think about it, that could be your cell phone through your cell phone provider, but it could also be in your car through GM and OnStar. The network must be robust and designed with sufficient diversity and redundancy to ensure survivability. And I think we've all heard with all of the fires and floods and hurricanes why that's become important. And that no single point of failure should impact the day-to-day 911 and public safety answering point operations. That it should be built to support all new and evolving technical and operating standards as they're developed. And there is standards work going out there, quite a bit of it. Probably the most prominent one we hear about in Next Gen 911 right now is what they call the I3 standard. The network must have set standards and specs for use and must be designed with sufficient capacity to support all legacy and IP applications for statewide public safety needs. So again, the scaling of the network becomes critical. If you even just think in your normal world about how all of your devices and what you do on the various kinds of devices, and particularly when you introduce some of the capacity hogs like video, scaling becomes very critical. It must allow and support the migration to a consolidation of equipment as well as sharing of equipment under a hosted model. Again, part of the benefits of Next Gen 911 is to not have to physically have everything existing where it exists today. There are operational efficiencies that can be introduced. And the last one I added on, and I think it goes to the chairman's question, but funding and deployment must assure that no Colorado county is left behind. And I know that in the task force meetings I've been at, whether I've heard from the smaller counties or the larger counties, they all have this desire to not just have things deployed in the large urban areas at the expense of the rural counties, such that it precludes the other counties from ever achieving the same next-gen 911 capabilities. So with that, I'll move into what are the basic, what I call the basic building blocks required for next-gen 911. And again, I'm going to touch on these at a really high level, but I really believe in surveying information that's out there and the work that's been done to date. These are the 5 categories. If I'm missing any, the audience can speak up, but these are the 5 categories that really need to have a set implementation and transition plan in order to successfully achieve next-gen 911. So technology and standards, operations, funding, governance and policy, education and awareness. And I think if we keep thinking about it in these 5 categories, it might help us frame what next steps we need to undertake as a 911 community. In any one of these categories, there's interdependencies on something in another category, so it's not always easy to think of them individually and cleanly with a real clean line between them, because a decision in one area can impact something else in another area, but it gives an idea of the breadth of this. So starting with technology and standards. As you saw in the diagrams, there's a range of components and connections involved in any technical architecture that you decide. Right now, our legacy networks have very separate trunks and links, and these very separate networks are provided into each PSAP or 911 authority's PSAP. They provide very reliable 911 service today, but they are limited in their ability to handle all the other kinds of emergency communications we thought about, and limited in being able to support an environment that's a consolidated environment should a 911 authority want to do that. So some of the questions, and I just put a handful of them on here, I'm sure there are many more, that need to be addressed in the technology and standards arena are which ones exist, which ones are we going to, I say we, the collective 911 community, require be adhered to for the deployment and the transition. Should there be a single statewide IP-based network or regional networks at any point in the diagram? Is PSAP interoperability necessary and best achieved at the state, regional, and local level? Should it be a single cutover? Should you have a phased approach? There's lots of different network topologies that can be used and what are best to address redundancy, diversity, and survivability. What's the right switching and data technology? Do we need to have, are we needing to require what we call separate data packet types into classifications or classes of service? So in other words, do you have to be able to prioritize calling within the network? Today, just generally for calling in an IP network, that doesn't happen. All calls are treated, and if you have enough capacity and there's never a log jam, no big deal. Is there a need for any of that is one of the questions. So you're going to see my little conclusion here at the end of each one of these categories, which is the development of a viable and practical statewide plan and transition model is key to this. And this is my opinion, and certainly the folks in the room might have a different opinion, but unless we have that statewide plan and transition plan that we all keep referring back to, it's going to be a very difficult, slow, and probably more costly implementation of next gen 911. So my advice would be, let's not wing it. Let's go in with a plan that has as best we can consensus across these stakeholders in order to move forward.
Mr. Troy, one of the things I'm thinking of from this conversation is, if we did have a large-scale emergency like we had in Colorado Springs or other parts with fires, if everybody starts to use video to report into 911, could that be the logjam you keep referring to? I mean, processing a phone call is one thing. Processing large packets of video from multiple sources I guess that's what I'm assuming when you're talking about lockdown?
Yeah, well, and we certainly have network experts in the room, but yeah, you are going to have methods and procedures, operations, and your network built to handle a certain amount of the types of calls that would come in. And those are the good examples, or, you know, when there's a crash and everybody starts calling and texting and everything, and all of a sudden you have a major load onto the system, video being a huge load. So I don't know at this point within each of our PSAPs and 911 authorities how they're even going to want to handle video. Do they want their call takers to take it? Do they want it to go directly to first responders? Who should even get video or not? It has legal issues, liability issues, all sorts of things that need to be thought about before whoever is building the network, they can make some assumptions about how much and what they need to build. But until you kind of know what you want to do with all of this stuff, you really don't know how to size your network the best. Or maybe you start with a certain thing, but you have the ability to grow the network very quickly. But I think Comcast and a few others can tell you how much capacity video actually takes up in the network, just in everybody's day-to-day activities with Netflix, much less if they're trying to ship videos at a fire or an accident site. So moving on to operations, modifications to existing practices, procedures, and resources are going to have to be thought through as well. What are the call takers' expectations and responsibilities? How do you coordinate across PSAPs? If there is an environment where we have more than one basic emergency service providers, or with all of the application providers and telecom providers, what are the operational requirements that need to be in place to make sure everything interconnects? What are our operational requirements around service quality and cybersecurity and disaster recovery and business continuity? In a PSAP environment where they have a lot of other applications, hosted service, they may be hosted services or they may be resident at their PSAP, but around CAD systems. I just put a couple examples up here. Medical record systems. There's a whole host of things that could take place in that environment that's going to need to have operational decisions made about it. And, you know, again, if you're in a local environment with a local 911 authority, they're going to be the ones deciding that. But we, as the entire system, kind of need to know what's all taking place there. So if there is a piece of the network that has to interact with it, we know how that network needs to interact. So as you can see, there's governance and decision points all along the spectrum here. Funding, it's one of everybody's favorites. Today, there are a number of revenue sources for funding. 911 surcharges being the main one that funds the 911 authorities and the PSAPs. And those are a fee on landlines. They're on phone service today, on voice phone service, including prepaid. Because we have different authorities, their models for funding vary. I don't know what all their funding sources are, but I know not all of them are funded 100% by their 911 surcharge. The surcharge does bring in money to support and pay for, and is expected to pay for basically PSAP operations pretty much in their entirety. So everything from paying the basic emergency service provider for those network components to the personnel in the PSAP, et cetera. Because there will be, because there will be new, as you saw from the chart, and you asked the question, you know, are these capital expenses? What are they? We will need to look at, I don't know if it's a new funding source, it likely is a new funding source, or if it's just going to, the expectation is going to be either in transition or finally that the 911 surcharge needs to cover everything. But there are lots of different paths you could take in terms of looking at funding. there's state, local, and federal funding. There may be more federal funding coming, we'll see, for the deployment of Next Gen 911. I'll talk about that in a little bit. But it could be through taxes, through membership fees, grants and loans. We have opportunities at the commission through the high cost fund or creating an advanced services fund to fund this as well. And it could be that you look at stages of maybe a funding source for capital deployment of this, the core infrastructure of Next Gen 911 through one funding source is a viable path, and then you leave the surcharge to cover their ongoing operations and expenses at the PSAP, and that way the surcharge doesn't need to go up as much in each particular county. One of the challenges we have is because surcharges are currently tied to the number of access lines in a particular area. Each 911 authority sets their surcharge amount. That's where you start running into some of the issues of it. This is a very costly deployment. You probably can't raise your surcharge in San Juan County high enough to cover the deployment of all of this. So when you start looking at the cost and you decide what your transition implementation is going to be, are we going to find ourselves, what is going to be the most efficient and best path through this? Is it easiest to go to the legislature or somewhere else and create a new funding source or not? And we've got to work through that. And some work has been done, and I'll talk about that a little bit later around some of these issues. So. And then finally, almost finally, governance and policy. There are today, pretty much there is your telecom providers who work with their end user customers. We have our BESP or CenturyLink who has a certain component part. The commission has governance over and sets out the rules around that. And then you have the 911 authorities who manage their PSAP environment and what takes place there. NG911, I don't know that it totally turns it on its head, but it does bring up the opportunity to re-examine what is the right governance and policy in this space to best have Next Gen 911 deployed and managed. So you need to identify what are those responsibilities, the barriers, are there privacy concerns, what are new liability concerns. We have a whole area that even at a national level is just starting to be looked at around what we call 911 Next Gen 911 awareness and accessibility, and the accessibility piece being for the deaf and hard of hearing and the blind and others that really stand to benefit from this technology. What sorts of governance and policies need to be put in place to make sure that just like you don't want a small rural county left out, you don't want certain groups of consumers left out from these Next Gen 911 capabilities. So we are going to have to clarify jurisdictional frameworks and responsibilities at each of our levels of government and update regulations, possibly legislation and other policies to reflect this. So back to my point, viable and practical statewide plan and transition model is important. And the last area I'll touch on as far as the building blocks is education and awareness. I think sometimes the expectations are already out there around if I have a device and a device is capable in my consumer world of accomplishing a text or a video or something else like that, those expectations are there for 911 as well. And so it's critical that there is, just like they did when everything converted to digital TV, that there's awareness campaigns and public education around as we transition to this, what can consumers expect and what can't they? There's a text trial going on right now where the major wireless carriers are going to be doing text to 911, but most PSAPs right now aren't ready to support text to 911 technologically, operationally, policy-wise. And so the carriers are being made to give what they call bounce back messages to say, it's nice that you just texted to 911, but this doesn't work where you're doing it. So when you start thinking about the rollout of this and all the different component parts, the consumer awareness used to always kind of fall into calling 911 and reverse 911. And there's obviously lots of issues still around reverse 911. Now it just adds a number of other layers to that when you have all of these other different methods and that can do it. So who's responsible for that? How do we get it deployed? How do you fund it, et cetera? So that needs to be another building block that's thought about in all of this. So, are there any questions on those parts of it, or I can move on to what activities have been worked on so far at the local and federal level?
I don't think I need an answer to this now, but perhaps at some point, either from you or from someone who's already wanting to respond, I'd like to be educated on how law enforcement and the emergency responding community just day in and day out interfaces to make sure they're getting what they need and that they're going to get what they want and need in the future, and are involved. And I know everybody here knows a lot more about that than I do, but I just would like to know that.
Sure, and I will leave that to those folks to say.
You know, Mr. Attorney, I don't have any questions at this point, but I really want to compliment you. We always have high expectations for you, and you consistently exceed them. So really, I've been learning so much in just this first 45 minutes. You've clarified so many things, and it's so helpful. But I also want to compliment everybody here who's involved in this process. I don't think citizens realize we all take for granted 911, and to go through this and realize tremendous cooperation and complexity. It's just remarkable what you all accomplished so seamlessly. So I want to thank you before we keep with the presentation.
Well, thank you. So, so now I'm going to jump back to the some of the activities that have gone on to date and who are some of the players on those. And so we're not starting from scratch. There are a number of things that documents, standards, things that can be relied on that can be pulled together to really drive forward. Starting at the federal level, back in 2004, Congress enacted the Enhanced 911 Act, created a National Implementation Coordination Office to advise and assist grant-eligible entities on the preparation of statewide 911 plans, to act on the grant applications and oversee the use of grant funds. A couple of things that did, and the federal level, they like to have one point of contact in a state, and just for efficiencies of doing that, they usually reach out to the governor's office, and the governor's office designates that. Because the state of Colorado does not have one statewide 911 entity, but there was interest in getting some of the grant money. In order to get the grant money, you had to have a statewide 911 plan. The governor's office designated the PUC. But again, that didn't necessarily give the PUC the authority to make all the decisions over all of this, but it did give it a centralized point. And then we relied on our resource center to help in that process in terms of pulling together a statewide 911 plan. And then we did. A number of our authorities received some grants, mostly to further phase 2 911 wireless 911. But some of them used it for some upgrades to be next-gen 911 capable in their PSAPs. I'll talk about it in the state level one, but there was the creation of a statewide 911 plan. It's at this point very high level, was sufficient for purposes of what the federal government was asking for, but is not to the level of detail it needs to be to move to complete next-gen 911. So in 2009, that act expired. Under the, in 2011, under the Tax Bill and Job Creation Act, they authorized $115 million in funds for implementation of Next Gen 911, but said that they would get that money through radio spectrum auction sometime before 2015. Again, statewide 911 plan required to receive some funding, so that's future. 2012, the FCC and NINA and APCO are some, I'll call them nationwide associations that are very, very big in the public safety space that really direct and figure out a lot of what happens and needs to happen for 911 on a national basis. But they and the 4 largest wireless carriers reached agreement on an interim solution for text to 911, and I talked a little bit about that. Probably one of the more interesting ones was in 2013, the FCC issued its legal and regulatory framework recommendations to Congress. Congress asked them to say, so how should all of this nationwide next-gen 911 roll out? The FCC opened a docket. A lot of parties commented in that docket, and I will, on the next slide, review the conclusions from what they said. I did want to point out, though, on this slide, I underwhelmed what NINA and APCO and the U.S. Department of Transportation, actually, at the federal level, have done a lot of work studying 911, next gen. How do you do it? How do you transition to it? What does it mean to you? What do you need to think about? And there's a wealth of documents on that. The links at the bottom of this page are where you can find those documents. So back to the FCC's recommendation to Congress. Probably paramount, particularly given how Colorado is structured for 911, was after taking input from the stakeholders, the FCC said to Congress, I am not overtaking next-gen 911 and the authority away from, preempting the states or taking the authority away from the states and local governments. They said local and state public safety authorities should retain their primary responsibility for deployment and configuration of next-gen 911, and Congress, and they said, Congress, you should encourage the states to establish or empower state 911 boards. They did kind of like this statewide concept. But again, everything is couched in encourage. Or similar state-level government entity to provide technical and operational expertise necessary for the deployment of next-gen 911. So the particular bullet items underneath this, probably what's key in that is encouraging the elimination of the legacy as quickly as you can and taking a technology-neutral approach to next-gen 911. Encouraging standards, encouraging, one of the thoughts they had is, how do we get the states and help the states to move faster? Well, perhaps if we put out some grant money that for those states who start moving quickly, then they can get some grant money. So I think their thoughts and ideas of what they like to push, they'll probably push through not mandating, but encouraging people through grants and conditioning the funds on that. They encourage Congress to really look at their communications laws to support next-gen 911 for people with disabilities. And then finally, they're looking and wanting to have, encouraging the states to adopt and expand and have uniform definitions of entities that may obtain certification to act as next-gen 911 service providers. They did say in there that where a state has preempted itself through legislation or other activities from being able to be in the next-gen space at all, whether that was through IP legislation or something that simply preempts any state law or regulations in that space, that they will serve as a backdrop. But their preference was to have the states figure it out, or the FCC's recommendation to Congress was to have the states figure it out. So that's on the federal level, and I'm going to jump over to Colorado and what next-gen activities have happened to date. And again, there's more details here. I tried to capture these at a high level, but in 2010, the 911 Resource Center hosted workshops to begin the creation of a statewide 911 plan. That does exist. It's on the Resource Center website. Daryl does keep it updated and keeps filling in as we learn more and we get more detail, but we still have a long way to go. Also in 2010, that's when the study I mentioned from Mission Critical Partners was undertaken, and that also is available out on the website, and talked about what it thought were some recommendations in those building block areas that I mentioned. In 2010 and 2011, we had 2 telecom providers come to the PUC and file applications to also be competitive basic emergency service providers. Because of the complexities and the unknowns on all the issues I previously talked about before, their tariffs were suspended when all parties talked about it, and if those providers are here today, they can certainly add their own information there. But those applications were withdrawn. They were simply, at that point in time, premature. We weren't far enough along to be able to figure out whether those were really in the public interest or not. In 2011, there was a Colorado this is I believe this is the Mission Critical Partner Report, the Next Gen 911 System Report. There's been a series of 911 summits now that are held once a year that kind of bring to bear and educate statewide all of the different stakeholders on what are the key issues going on and what has been done to date. So that happened. And then in the 2012 summit, they convened an open discussion on how best to move forward in formulating consensus on Next Gen 911. And as part of that, a Next Gen 911 steering committee was created that was made up of the primary participants in that were the 911 authorities, the 58 911 authorities, and they even had a voting structure and everything in order to come to consensus. And then the rest of us, whether it was the PUC or the telecom providers, et cetera, would participate in those meetings, but they were trying to really, on their own, see if they could come into consensus on all of this. Later on that year, the task force voted to suspend the steering committee work to be able to then informally consider a CenturyLink proposal for Next Gen 911. So as you'll see, it sounds like and feels like a bunch of fits and starts, but all the way through this, there's been a lot of learning, and people are just trying to get, how do we come together with the right model and the right consensus to keep moving forward. So all of the information and work that's been done today is useful and informative to moving forward, but it hasn't been able to drive a conclusion to anything. In some subsequent task force meetings, bandwidth.com came back in and presented what they thought a good and appropriate NG911 solution might be. Level 3 talked about what they're doing at the next task force meeting in the 911 space and where they'd like to go. In May, as you all are aware, CenturyLink filed an advice letter to implement a portion of this Next Gen 911 architecture, the routing and transport piece. Tariff was suspended. I forgot to put in the date. I knew I'd find at least one typo in here. Okay. June 12th. Okay. And then just this past week, CenturyLink filed a motion to stay in the notice of waiver of the tariff deadline, and that's the point we moved this CIM over into the administrative docket, which was the petition filed in July by multiple 911 authorities requesting an administrative proceeding to investigate how best to provide Next Gen 911 for Colorado. So that brings us current to what the activities that have been done and where we're at to date. And I stuck my theory again up at the top about the viable and practical statewide plan and transition model. I don't know how much we're looking for conclusions in today's CIM, but you all have before you an administrative proceeding that I think provides the necessary and structured venue for all of us stakeholders to come together and try and reach consensus, identify alternatives if we can't reach consensus, identify the benefits and risks of those alternatives, and try and get a detailed statewide next-gen 911 plan in place. So with that, I'll leave it at that for questions.
Commissioner Turpin?
I don't have any questions. I do want to echo the chairman's comments. This was an excellent one. I
Thank
appreciate
you.
it very much.
Several people helped me work on it,
Just a few.
just a few.
Well, clearly you have a wonderful team effort. Let me propose or suggest that perhaps some of the 911 providers could care to come up and we can have a dialogue, and then we'll do the same thing with the providers. But when I look and say, what did we do as a commission? What's perhaps the most important functions we can do to provide to assist the state? It's to work with all of you to make sure we have just an outstanding 911 program, which we clearly do. So this is a lot of mission critical as we can get.
So I know there's a lot in the audience, and I think several signed up to speak. I know they're not bashful at the task force meeting, so, Joe and others, come on up.
And please don't be shy, because this is an opportunity for us to understand our role. Please just identify yourself. And this is, as far as we're concerned, a conversation. This is an educational opportunity for us. Even maybe there are some grievances. Identify yourself. There's other mics at the table also.
My name is Tim Compliment. I'm with CenturyLink. I'm not close enough there. Go ahead and
Please.
just, okay.
So,
So,
again, this is informal. This is just an opportunity for all of us to have a conversation.
okay. Well, first, thank you for taking the time to listen to these issues. As Lynn pointed out, you can see we have been talking about this for quite a few years since I've been the regulatory director for Colorado. This has been an ongoing issue that never seems to really resolve itself. Lynn talked about a lot of things that I'd like to talk about in some way. Of course, I distilled it down into an acronym because I work for a communications company. So we'll say that this is a good start. And by start, we mean statewide, affordable, reliable, and transition. And I think those are the main key elements to how we move from E911 to next generation 911. Statewide, I think, is probably the most important. And the reason being, we've got lots of different costs, geographies, population densities across the state. But we all like to enjoy the entire state. I live in Douglas County. I work in Denver. I'm going to be in Summit County at the end of the week. Travel to Routt County. I like to go to Mesa County. So I think as a citizen, we would all like to see the same type of functionalities, features, the things that I can do at my house or I can do at my office, I'd like to be able to do anywhere, and I think a lot of citizens feel that way. And so by having it statewide, you can then also spread costs more effectively, because we do have some that have more than others, and so I think that makes it affordable, which kind of gets into the A. If you start to regionalize some of the network, I think you take away a few things. I think you start getting into a little bit about reliability, which I'll get to, but you start to really impact affordability for all. And I think that any provider that comes in and wants to serve the state of Colorado for next gen 911, I think that's the obligation that they need to meet. They should be able to do it for all. This isn't, the way I look at 911, this isn't, this is either you're in or out. This isn't a for some or for many or for most, it's for all. And I think that's an important piece. When we talk about reliability, Lynn made the comment that IP is more reliable. I don't think that's right. 911 service as today is extremely reliable, and it will continue to be reliable tomorrow, regardless of the platform that a carrier uses. We're transitioning as carriers into IP because it gives us all greater features and functionalities that we don't enjoy off of our traditional copper voice or TDM network. So it's really just a technology shift, just like we've shifted for years and years and decades in this industry. But when we talk about reliability, I think that's some of the things that we're trying to understand as a community, as a state, is how reliable do you want it? And then what are the costs associated with doing it that way? You know, you saw some of the pictures of the architecture. There's lots of different ways to architect this. And they're all relatively complicated, which is why I do public policy work. But I think that what we need to try to understand, and what we put out in our tariff was what we felt was a pretty well gold-plated type of offering. Now maybe it was too much, maybe it wasn't. But I think that's what we were trying to get the dialogue with, was, okay, we'll finally put something on the table, and I think that's what a lot of the issues were over the last few years, is, okay, we've seen some presentations, but put something on the table, put some numbers down, and then let's start talking about, do we really want these features, these functionalities in this core network? So I think reliability kind of talks to what kind of thing you want to build. You want a Rolls Royce, you want a Buick, which one would you like? And I think any carrier can build it that way. And then when we talk about transition, as Lynn also demonstrated, I think, very well on that slide, it is very complex. And what elements need to go along for a period of time, what elements are no longer necessary as you start pricing next gen. And I think that, again, was one of the issues that we put forth in our tariff, was there might be some elements that are contained in here that we don't need in here, because they are in E911. And as we transition, they'll be phased out and we don't need to capture them here. Or there might be some elements that you do need to capture in the next gen, but how do we account for those costs? Because we're recovering them right now and charging for them in E911. They're going to be there in the future, but again, you don't want to pay twice for something that you get. So how do you transition from one to the other? So I think those are some important things. And I think, though, just in the most simplest terms, next gen for what we're talking about here is, it's still the aggregation and transport of emergency communications. All IP does is gives you greater functionality. Instead of voice, now we're talking about text or video or pictures, things like that. So we're still talking about a core network that can deliver those things. And where we see the regulation in that is for just that part, is for making sure that there's a statewide, dedicated, private network that can aggregate and transport emergency communications. On the other side of the PSAP is where all the other vendors and other carriers can compete for those types of services, to give those PSAPs the opportunity to receive video, to take text, to deliver those messages out to their first responders. So I think really at the core, we're still talking about aggregating and transport for 911, for emergency communication. And so now we're just trying to figure out, where do you draw that line? How do you build that network? And then ensuring, like one of the points that Lynn made, was ensuring that there's enough bandwidth in that network to then handle whatever the PSAPs would like. And one of the things, I think Lynn might have mentioned, one of the things was, do you want to host other, multiple PSAPs, and you can have that. And again, I think that's outside of the core network. That's an additional functionality that an IP network will enable. So it was, if you just remember one thing I said, it would start, I guess, is all I'm looking for. Do you have any questions for me?
One question. I agree with, of course, you're the experts, you're only public affairs, but I'll agree with everything you say. But is there a worry that if our job is to really define that basic function to make sure that 911 always works, that then we allow the free market to compete for the additional services? Will that leave people behind? Will we see the competition for the enhanced video or whatever to be available only for the metropolitan areas and disadvantage the rest of the state? And I recognize we have to maintain that fundamental public service, but is that a concern you have as we turn this into a competitive arena that we could leave people behind?
I see what you're saying, and I don't. And the reason I don't is because there are different degrees of needs for each of these areas. But I think as long as you have the core competency, I think then the communities themselves, because we aren't managed statewide, as Lynn has also pointed out. And so I think then these individuals can decide, well, what other things do I want to add on? Now, if we decide that there are certain core things that need to be part of a regulated tariff solution that is cost-based and spread across, I think those are the decisions that we can discuss here, and I think that's exactly what we want to talk about. But do you want to say that a particular county must have, as part of its buying, these 10 things, when really maybe they don't need all of those things? Or maybe it's just overkill to have that and they can have some sort of scaled down version of it. But it raises a good question. But I don't think that for purposes of forcing folks to buy, I think we need to sort of figure out what is it that you really need, and then what are the nice bells and whistles that some will have and some may not choose to have.
My name's Joseph Benkert. I'm the attorney for the Boulder 911 Authority. Several years ago, I also represented Dash when they applied for a CPCN to be a competitive BESP. I think the approach that Boulder has tried to take is trying to be very practical and have the system that is developed driven by actual operational needs of first responders and PSAPs. When Mission Critical Partners delivered their report, they emphasized that Colorado already has a very robust redundant system. And this is at very low cost because a number of years ago, the PUC allocated monies from a settlement of quality of service complaint to pair all the selective routers and interconnect them all. So that we have redundancy, we have the ability to transfer calls from one PSAP to another, and because of the way they were funded, they didn't go into the rate base. They stated that many of the states that are proceeding more quickly to deploy Next Gen 911 are doing so to get the redundancy and the ability to transfer calls that we already have, and that we have time to make sure we get it right. We don't have to be on the bleeding edge and waste money on technologies which don't prove out. That being the case, we believe that the decision of when and how to deploy Next Gen 911 should be driven by the services and features that are available and what their practical utility is. For example, one major initial reason to go to Next Gen 911 was stated to be text to 911. Text to 911 is critical to the hearing and speech impaired community. Use of TDD devices has declined 80% in the last 10 years. Every PSAP has a TDD device, yet most speech and hearing impaired people communicate with text messaging. In the current docket in which the FCC has proposed to require wireless providers and over-the-top providers to deliver text messages to PSAPs, and there was an agreement among the 4 major national carriers in NENA. Those will now be delivered over the existing TDD devices, over web interfaces to dedicated smartphones that a PSAP, as Denver currently handles 911 calls from that community. Text is also important, I would say, for silent call situations such as a battered wife hiding in a closet from her abusive husband, where she's heard, will suffer further abuse. And we found that text messaging can transmit further than voice calls. So people are out in the wilderness where they can't get a voice call through, can effectuate the rescue through text messaging. When it comes to pictures and videos, and so just again, text messaging does not require deployment of Next Gen 911. When it comes to pictures and videos, they're not covered by the current text messaging rulemaking the FCC has, because when you attach pictures or videos or other things to SMS text message, it becomes an MMS text message, which the commission isn't addressing. And so right now, video to the PSAP isn't available because there isn't a way of getting video into the system. When I drafted comments on behalf of BRESA and the 911 task force in an FCC rulemaking about 2 years ago, the general consensus was that like text messaging for the general public, not those limited areas of need, video and photographs probably in the ordinary case won't add anything to emergency response or dispatch. It may slow dispatch because of having to wade through more information. It could have an impact on dispatchers. An example I used, there was a couple years ago, a crash between a plane and a glider by the Boulder Airport, and there were body parts strewn around the area that even had the first responders had emotional difficulties. And laymen running around with phone cameras trying to figure out what pictures to send to E911 would pick the most sensational. They'd send body parts, not anything useful. You would also have people perhaps trying to get pictures and not being situationally aware and running out in front of traffic to get a better picture. And so we're not sure, Brett's is not sure that there's in fact a great need. They think that pictures and video would be good for prosecution, investigation after the fact, but not necessarily for first response, where the primary information needed by the PSAP is the location and the nature of the emergency. And they're not going to dispatch more units, additional units, until there's a professional first responder on scene who does a professional assessment of what's required. As we move on to rule-based routing with overflow calls, which is one of the capabilities. Currently, the network is supposed to be built to a PO1 grade of service where not more than one call in 100 would be blocked during the busy hour of the busy season. However, with wireless calling, it's not unusual for a PSAP to receive over 100 wireless calls related to a single accident. Even if we had PO1 grade of service, there's no PSAP, individual PSAP, that has the personnel, the physicians, the equipment to take that many calls. One option is that you can have that with a PSAP, with Next Gen 911, is that the system knows how many operators are signed on at each PSAP and knows when they're occupied and would route additional calls to other PSAPs. However, in order for that to actually be used, implemented, the PSAP that would receive those calls, if they're going to try and dispatch, they would have to know and have access to the available units and their status at the first PSAP. They would have to know if that PSAP was already responding to that emergency, or if it was a new emergency that was being called in. They would have to have access to their business rule. Business rule, for example, is on a domestic dispute, we send 2 police cars. They would have to have access to the radio systems to dispatch those first responders in the other jurisdiction. And there's also a question of whether they would have governmental immunity when handling and dispatching a call in another jurisdiction in which doesn't employ them. Those questions aren't answered, those elements aren't in place. And those kind of elements will also impose costs on the first responder agencies and the PSAPs. And so, we believe that this needs to be, as we move forward, we need to have the stakeholders involved get a better understanding of the total cost of implementation and the practical utility of the services. That's what we're trying to do through the RFI process. And to have it driven by what will improve public safety, not by some pie-in-the-sky visions of, the way they do things on TV. There's discussion of having medical records in the cloud and that these would be available to first responders. There was an article on LinkedIn a couple weeks ago about a doctor who had put his information in the cloud, and he had an emergency, he couldn't speak, and the first responders diagnosed that it was related to a virus he'd had previously, and there were people saying, oh, this is why we need to have information in the cloud. First responders aren't trained or insured to make diagnosis of patients in the field. In fact, they diagnosed the person wrong. It wasn't a virus, it was an aortic aneurysm. If they had delayed transfer longer while they were trying to diagnose them and the aneurysm had burst, the doctor would be dead. The way, in fact, that the man was saved is they did what the role is. They transported him to an emergency room where doctors who are trained and equipped and have what they need did a proper diagnosis and operated. one of the most promising areas for improving 911 services in rural areas may be the ability to host CAD and telephone services. Within Boulder County, Bretza hosts its CAD system and has a hosted telephone service, so that for many of our PSAPs, they do have visibility into the other agencies, and each PSAP doesn't have to have the expense of its own CAD system, its own telephone system. When I was representing Dash, they actually...
Can you explain what that means? I mean, can you give me an example?
Yes, and instead of having the 911 telephone system that identifies the alley, brings that in for the call and routes it to the position in each PSAP, we have the 2 off-site locations, which are very hardened, and there are redundant routes into our PSAPs. And so we don't have to invest in 4 telephone systems, 1 for each of our PSAPs, we have 2. We have 1 CAD server installed in one of our PSAPs and a backup location, and we don't have that installed at each PSAP. That's a $2 million item. With hosted services in the next Gen 911 environment, a PSAP in a rural area, instead of having to purchase a CAD system, purchase a telephone system, would have a thin client provided by a hosting provider, be connected by the IP network, and the thin client, and they would pay a per month per seat license fee, and the actual intelligence, the actual servers would be installed at central locations and maintained by a commercial provider. And this could be less cost than the capital expense of purchasing the actual systems in the PSAP, because essentially the cost of the intelligence would be shared among the PSAPs which subscribe to the services. And so Dash thought that, in fact, it might be the rural authorities would upgrade to Next Gen 911 first in order to get this capability. However, in the Next Generation 911 Steering Committee, a vote was taken and seemed to be unanimously agreed to that a PSAP which wants to take a hosted service should pay for the additional bandwidth for the hosted service itself, rather than having other PSAPs which are buying their capital equipment, subsidizing these other people and avoiding those expenses. In fact, the 911 surcharge does not cover all of PSAP expenses. It covers the 911 surcharge. At Bretzel, we also use it for the CAD system and the recording system, essentially for the transmission, receipt, processing, and recording of 911 calls, not for the radio side, not for dispatcher salaries. And part of that is if we start using them for general public safety purposes, it would stop being a surcharge, it would start to be a tax and subject to payment. Different authorities have different interpretations, they use them to different extents. I don't believe any authority has enough money out of the surcharge to cover all of its expenses of operating a PSAP. But, you know, the question becomes, if we're not going to pay for the additional bandwidth, essentially if a hosting provider was currently available in Colorado, the PSAPs could currently subscribe to hosted service. The CenturyLink tariff, according to their presentations earlier this year, does not include bandwidth for hosted services, and that would not be tariff, that would be purchased out of their catalog. And so that really isn't, 911 isn't essential for that. I think it will be facilitated by Next Gen 911. And so to bring it back to, I think, where our position is we think that decisions made on how and what to deploy, what services and features to make available should be driven by decisions at the local level by the stakeholders who understand best their practical utility and whether investment in these capabilities is better than the number of first responders they have on the street or the equipment they have, because it's not an unlimited amount of money that they have available to provide for the public safety. And in order to get there, we think we need to have the conversation, the information brought forward by service providers and people who want to offer these features and services. What is the practical utility? What is our total cost of deployment? You know, if we're getting video, how much additional storage space do we need to have for those videos? Do we need to have equipment and training for our first responders that we don't have now? And let those decisions be driven from the local level by the people who best know how to use this technology to serve the public interest, the public safety.
Hi, I'm Monica. Is this on? There we go. I'm Monica Million. I'm the operations manager for the Grand Junction Regional Communications Center in Mesa County. I'm going to speak to a couple of points the two gentlemen before me made before I go to the point I was going to speak to. In agreement with the gentleman from CenturyLink, I think the purpose for the PUC and this new infrastructure is to regulate the core of the routing and transmitting of the data. And then to Mr. Benkirk's point, you know, after that, what services at a PSAP level is my authority wanting to attain? And to your question, ma'am, about operationally, what are the expectations in the field of the first responders? They are actually pretty terrified that first responders are going to get that video feed. We already have enough difficulties with the technology and the patrol vehicles and the fire apparatus of keeping a cool and correct environment to maintain this equipment. And now you talk about streaming video live to whether they're handheld devices or apparatus within the vehicles. They're really not excited about that opportunity. Mr. Benkirk's point too, in the PSAPs, I've been at some national conversations from a PSAP operations conversation. We're talking about exposing dispatchers to a whole nother level of the situation that really is almost like a safety net for us. We just have to hear it. We don't necessarily have to see it. And there's a lot of discussion from an operations perspective as, is that really the direction we want to go? So the whole video streaming question is really unanswered. You know, really to Mr. Benkirk's point, this is all about texting and really what has happened with the technology for the deaf and hearing impaired community. And kudos to them really taking on the texting technology to communicate more effectively and efficiently. But the unfortunate thing is we're doing it over the old traditional TDY equipment because we don't have the correct infrastructure in place to receive it as we would from a device. Anyway, for the reason that I'm up here to speak really is several of us in the small, what I would have considered before yesterday, smaller, more rural part of the state, we had some concerns and wanted to make sure that our voice was heard. We don't always get to make appearances at the hearings, but we wanted to point out to the commission that, you know, we have a system in place with governance by the PUC that has worked for the last 20 years. And we really want, from your perspective, that for you to be reminded that whatever system we end up going to needs to be accessible and affordable. It has to be a single solution so that we're not alienating any citizens in the state, whether they're passing through, whether they live in San Juan County or Denver. And really remember that the steering committee that was put in place by the task force really came up with those principles to give us some guidance of how we develop the guidelines for how this infrastructure is built. And there is already a certification process to become a BESP in place, and that has worked effectively for us for the last 20 years. And we will be posting this as a comment collectively as a joint letter. I can speak to already a dozen counties that have signed on. Mesa County, Garfield, Montrose, Uray, Aspen, Pitkin, Gunnison, Hinsdale, San Juan, San Miguel, Alamosa, La Plata, and as recently as yesterday afternoon, Denver. So we'll be posting that as a comment to the commission.
May I make a further comment?
Please, Mr. Mayor.
Um,
We'd like this to be a dialogue and tell you, including Ms. Notoriani, this is tremendously helpful for me.
Bretza is one of the, Boulder 911 is one of the authorities which filed the application to host through the commission's facilities and services RFP. And part of the reason was that we have within our financial guidelines that very expensive purchases and expenditures, we get competitive bids on. And we also think that that would produce a better result. One of the difficulties that was faced by the applicants who came in and wanted to file CPCN for a competitive BESP service was that they're looking at, the legal fees alone would have been over $100,000 if they had to complete the process. Dash was acquired by bandwidth.com, which wasn't sure if it wanted to go forward or not, and withdrew. But by the end, they would have been well over $100,000 just in legal fees alone, travel expenses, and other expenses of pursuing a CPCN, not knowing if they would get any customers at the end. And there are also some impediments to competitive emergency service providers in the state, such as we now have a 911 selective router that figures out where a call is coming from and what PSAP it goes to. You might, if you have competitive providers, since no local exchange carrier is confined to any particular jurisdiction, they tend to go across jurisdictional boundaries. They may have to implement a selective router function within their own ILEC systems in order to figure out which BESP was to get a particular 911 call. And we want to see competition. We also wanted to do it through the process we suggested as an alternative to just the tariff process, because in the tariff process that we would have been going through with CenturyLink, you have to be represented by attorneys. I've been a telecom attorney for 30 years, and I know when you get into these proceedings, they're very esoteric, total service long-run incremental cost models, looking at their costs. You have to have your economic experts and accountants involved. It tends to be very expensive and tends to limit the parties that would be involved. We're actually glad we're moving to the RFI process because we think, we're not under pressure now of having a potential provider who could then become the default without any competition. And the RFI process will give us the opportunity to get broader information, we believe, and to include all of the 911 authorities and stakeholders in the state, because they don't need counsel, they don't need any specialized expertise, and we can share all this information with them. We'd like to structure it so we have the responses to the RFI go into a series of facilitated workshops with vendors in a way to put them together that they make sense subject matter wise, and then have 2 or 3 what I'm going to call consensus workshops that would just be staff and the 911 authorities to see where the stakeholders can come to a consensus in what type of a system we want to have, how we want to transition to it, how we're going to fund it, those sorts of things, so we maintain our local control of 911, but also are able to develop what will best serve the state and all of us.
Yeah, if you don't mind, I'd like to make a comment. That sounded a lot like an RFP. And I think when we talked about transitioning this over to an RFI was more of a, we need to understand some policy answers before we can decide how we move forward. And what I keep hearing Joe say is so that individually they can still decide what they want to buy. And I think that's ultimately going to be the answer that we need is this going to be a statewide network or is it not? I think that is really where we're looking for guidance from the commission, is to help understand some of these policy issues, because really Colorado is very unique and it doesn't have the statewide authority to make this purchasing decision, and not to say that we all want to take away the authority from the individuals, But we also need to think collectively, which I do agree though with Joe as to why we also push to get this turned into an RFI, is so that more folks could participate. Because we did not want to have a burden of attorney's fees and all those sorts of things, representation, limit folks who could come and attend. So I'm glad to see a lot of the participation already so far.
We're going to have somebody be patient. Why don't you identify yourself and we'll just keep going. Commissioner Turk.
Absolutely.
And we will open this up to the rest of the audience, and at some point, if this dialogue, is productive, we can take a break and then keep going. I think this is just, for me, I'm learning tremendous amount. I get the sense from my fellow commissioners, it's great. So please.
Hi, my name is Kent Sager. I sit on the 911 Authority Board for Logan County, Colorado. After looking at the tariff when it was produced, and I know it's been pulled back or stayed or whatever, it would increase our costs 5 times over what we're paying today. We're a small county, we run a really tight budget, and a 5 times increase in our upstream costs for 911 would break us. I mean, we could pay it, but there would be no money to add the new equipment that's going to be needed to use the 911 services, or the enhanced 911 services. I see a big disconnect here because nothing compels any of the carriers, the cell carriers, to connect to the BESP on the other side, except for 911 calls. So the cellular company in our area is already talking to us about bringing those services to us direct around the 911 system. So there's a potential of a train wreck there, because we are going to have all the cell carriers avoiding the costs of the BESP on the other side, trying to deliver direct to the PSAP. We're at a loss. I mean, we're running really tight on money, and it scared the heck out of us when we saw that those tariffs come out.
I wouldn't disagree with his comment about the costs and the fear it instilled in us from the smaller and more rural counties, but we also understand the benefit of it. That is why it needs to be one core network, so that the cost is shared across the state. Now, whether the initial tariff that was suggested in their filing is what ends up being the case, I doubt that to be, but it needs to be something that's cost effective for all of us, because as my constituent, or my partner here from Logan County spoke to, the tariff that they're suggesting will break most of the rural counties. They do not have the surcharge revenue in place to afford those tariff rates.
And come to the defense of CenturyLink, I think it was very important that they put a stake in the ground and said, let's start the dialogue, and the fact that you all, and Lynn again, you're the one who's been showing us tremendous leadership, making sure this all happens. Before we sort of ask some more, Commissioner Tucker, any questions before we open up to?
No, I don't. I do think where you're headed, some others have comments.
Because this is an open mic, this is an outstanding opportunity, so if there's anybody else who'd like to come forward or just stand and talk real loudly, we just have to make sure that people who are listening in via webcast have an opportunity to hear this also. Do any other folks who'd like to join the conversation?
I'm Jeff Irvin. Do I need to hold something? I'm Jeff Irvin. I'm the Executive Director of the Jefferson County Emergency Communications Authority. We're the 911 authority for both Jefferson and Bloomfield counties. I just want to give you a couple of practical examples from where we're at. First of all, we have been working diligently the last several years to standardize our system to where we're IP-based, to where we're ready for NG911. Our 10 PSAPs, we have 3 secondary and 7 primary PSAPs. We've also been able to partner with RTD to get fiber optic backbone network in at very low cost, and we're going to be able to eventually have all of our PSAPs networked. We're also doing a regionalization study to look at perhaps even some consolidation, whether it's virtual or physical consolidation of some of the PSAPs. So given all that, once this is all in place, what we need then is someplace to plug in this WAN, in essence, that we've created, and we hope that that is an EZNet or a cloud or something that we then can be next gen 911 with our system. So that's where we stand today, and there are some other systems within the front range area that are in that same position or near that. Second piece I want to speak to was, there's been several comments about video and the impact of video and bandwidth requirements. As I see it today, there's basically only two ways to make video calls: FaceTime via iOS or Skype. So at some point in time, we know it will happen in the future, maybe someone will be able to make a 911 call via those two mechanisms or whatever the future may bring. The one situation that I have in mind, which that would be useful, would be, say, an active shooter situation where you have a victim inside a school or inside an environment where they can provide intel, streaming video via that call to a PSAP. Now, whether the call taker views that, or the SWAT commander on the scene, or a commander in the comm center is able to look at that, that's very useful information on one application of that type of thing. This example that Joe gave with, willy-nilly looky-loos on site, sending in pictures of what have you, probably something more the media would be interested in, and not something that the PSAP would use directly. But I do see that there are instances, and I really see that is pretty low bandwidth communications relatively. Skype doesn't take up a lot of bandwidth, and these mechanisms will eventually be very viable for getting this type of information in. I was going to make a third point, and it's just eluded me, so I'll stand down unless you have questions.
You're more than welcome to come back. I do that all the time, unfortunately. I'm convinced I have 3 points, I have to get the third one.
That's all I have.
Thank you, Mr. Lee.
My name is Daryl Branson. I'm with the Colorado 911 Resource Center. I'll keep my comments brief, but first I must say that these comments are my own. They don't reflect those of my board of directors or any of our affiliates. I have something to add to the funding portion of Mrs. Notarianni's presentation. While the statute is written that 911 surcharge funds can be used, or at least it could be interpreted that they can be used for almost everything involved in PSAP operations and equipment, I'm not aware of any PSAP in Colorado that is completely funding its operations and capital costs through the 911 surcharge funds. All of them, to some extent, are receiving funds through the agencies that they dispatch for, through membership fees, or through direct payments from city and county budgets. This is an important point in that anything that we do that increases costs for PSAPs, either in terms of equipment or operations, will ultimately have some impact on city and local, city and county budgets as well. So that's something we need to keep in mind. Doesn't necessarily need to deter us from moving forward, but it is something that we need to be aware of when we're talking about funding. The second point I wanted to make is that, as Jeff just mentioned, there have been some comments today kind of questioning some of the benefits of the multimedia aspect of Next Gen 911. I would say that it is healthy to approach the claims of benefits from multimedia to 911 call centers with some skepticism. However, I think with every potential example of how they could be not useful, there are lots of examples of how they could be useful. One example that I use when I talk about the potential benefits of pictures to 911. I started my career as a 911 call taker and dispatcher myself in Springfield, Missouri, and then I worked in Wisconsin for a while, and then New Mexico. I took 911 calls in all three of those places as part of my affiliation with 911 call centers there. And over that career, I took a number of calls related to abductions. If you think of a person in a parking lot of a supermarket or anywhere they might be where they might witness an altercation taking place in a parking lot and then see somebody being forced into a vehicle and that vehicle driving away. If you think of what would be most beneficial to the first responders looking for that vehicle, a verbal description of that vehicle relayed by an eyewitness through a call taker to the first responders, or a photograph taken by an eyewitness that can then be sent directly to the first responders out in the field. In that case, a picture really is worth 1,000 words, so I think there are examples of where that can be beneficial. Concerning medical data, Mr. Benkirk gave an example of a recent example of cloud-based medical data that was perhaps improperly used in the field to try to diagnose a patient. While first responders probably shouldn't be trying to diagnose patients, that information could be used by an ER doctor to diagnose a patient once the patient arrives. So I think it's probably premature to say that multimedia data and medical data and other types of information that could be part of a next-gen 911 network, I think it's premature to say that that is not potentially useful. I think it probably waits to be seen in real-world applications and environments, which types of data are useful and which types aren't. The third point, and my final point that I would like to make is, it was mentioned that text to 911 is being supported now by the FCC and voluntarily through the big four cell phone providers, AT&T, T-Mobile, Sprint, and Verizon have all agreed voluntarily to offer text to 911 nationwide by May 15, 2014. And then the smaller carriers the FCC is in the process of putting mandates in place for the smaller carriers, but we're not exactly sure what the time frame on that is. Just because there's an interim solution being put in place doesn't mean that next-gen 911 is no longer necessary for text to 911. Even the FCC in all of their dockets, they're referring to this as an interim solution for text to 911. I don't believe that it is something that we should rely on as being something that will be indefinitely supported by the carriers or by FCC rule. And as such, I think that the FCC recognizes by calling it an interim solution that next-gen 911 is the final solution for text to 911, and that's probably the way that we should look at it as well. So again, these are my comments only, not those of my board or any of our affiliates or the 911 Advisory Task Force, but I thank you for your time unless you have any questions for me.
I think I would agree with Mr. Branson, but I think that in much of what he has said, but I think the decision as to what services a local authority and PSAP and first responder agencies want to receive, and whether the cost of those services and the likelihood of how frequently they have certain type of incidents makes sense for them to invest in that versus investing their limited funds in other public safety solutions is best driven by the local stakeholders. And I wasn't suggesting that we didn't need to go to next-gen 911 at all because there's an alternative interim solution for text messaging, just that if in the short term all we're going to do is, because by and large, I think in the Black Hawk, Iowa text 911 study, which is now going statewide, they average like 2 or 3 text messages a year. Is that worth paying the kind of rates that were in the CenturyLink tariff in order to be able to get 2 or 3 text messages a year, in areas of the state? That's just a timing decision, not that we won't eventually go there.
But I think the one thing I heard is, that Mr. Kunkelman pointed out, I think I'm hearing everybody say is, somebody, and I'm not sure exactly who does this, defines that core competence. And that's the focus, that there's going to be competition above that core competence. That's a different matter. It almost sounds like it would have to be a negotiation between a carrier and the PSAP as to whether you're going to adapt to be able to provide that service. But I think that's one area, one of the areas that I've heard so far.
Well, I think both bandwidth.com, which has made a presentation, and CenturyLink have suggested that it doesn't make sense to have more than one provider in the state. And I would share that, given looking at the things you'll have to do if you do have multiple providers, or you have the originating service providers working in jurisdictions. But there are things such as an ESI net may be, the natural monopoly service and operation of the data complexes might not be that. We're looking to get more information on this. It may be that you have your basic function and you have an obligation for the provider of the basic system to allow other providers to offer services over that system, and that could be offered on a competitive basis, such as the hosting services. And I think when you look at there's been talk about deregulating 911, We dealt with this in the last legislative session. And when you look at it, Next Generation 911 really has many of the indicia of a natural monopoly, even more so because of the fact you have only one customer in each jurisdiction.
And before I turn over to Ms. Notoriana to kind of wrap up, Commissioner Tarver, Commissioner Pat, do you have any further questions?
I think, I'm sure you're going to say this, but I just like to thank everyone for the effort that has been put in here, starting with Santoriani for pulling it all together, but every person who's been involved in this, and it's very gratifying to me to see that this is such a robust community of people, and I've seen all the names a lot, but it's great to put faces with the names.
The only favor I'd ask or request I have is on one of Ms. Notoriana's slides, she has future funding, and with estimates, and we heard from, forgive me for Mr. Sanger saying it could be as much as 5 times more for his county. If someone could give us tangible numbers on what is it currently, what is the surcharge, not just the per line surcharge, but the total, that would help inform us, but also legislators and other decision makers, so we have a sense of the magnitude of where this is going.
Well, I can tell you that when we prepared our tariff, we averaged the cost across the state in deploying the advanced bandwidth to all the PSAPs. And I would say that non-recurring type number is probably somewhere in the neighborhood of $5 million. And then, of course, there's operational impacts, monthly recurring type of charges that would go along with that. But that would be based on our estimates to deploy statewide and to, like I said, increase the functionality of the existing facilities. I don't know if that cost necessarily translates to other providers coming in. And then, as I indicated before, I do think that there are some elements that are part of that non-recurring and even part of the monthly operational expenses that may or may not need to be there. That as you transition away from one to the other, we don't need this one piece anymore. But what we looked at was, well, let's take a conservative approach and at least incorporate some of these things so that everybody can say, well, that's not really what I want. Because I think at the end of the day, what we want to do is provide whatever the state is interested in having. And if the state, I know Joe was making some comments about, does the state really need to have next generation? I don't know. I just know that a lot of folks want it. It's a popular word, and we do sell this in other states across the country. So I know it's something that's coming, but there is a good question of timing. Does the state want this or need this at this time? And what is it that they want or need?
Presently, Logan County pays $10,000 a year for our 911 call, our talk pads. Under the tariff, we would be paying just a little over $50,000 a year for the same amount of talk pads and have no additional functionality than we have today. There would actually be one more conversion. It would come into us IP, and we would have to either put in new equipment to take it in the IP format or convert it back to TDM.
And another county example from the tariff that was proposed was for Montrose. Currently, they pay about $2,000 for the same service, and that would increase to approximately $6,000 a month. That's a per month charge, not an annual for Montrose. To give you a...
Oh, that's very helpful. Mr. Troyan.
And I think this was acknowledged and mentioned earlier, but one of the areas that in the past, and I would expect going forward, that the commission can be of use and benefit is, and Quest mentioned it, they don't expect the price tag that they put down to be what necessarily the final price tag is. And there's options and ways to look at it, and the costs get scrutinized. And I think if we continue to come back to these core principles and be very smart about how we do this, we're going to make sure that as collectively as a stakeholder group, we aren't doing damage to Logan County or Grand Junction or some of the other areas of the state, or even potentially a big county in rolling this out. And so, like you mentioned, I appreciate CenturyLink putting a stake in the ground, and we just all need to be committed to making sure we keep those core principles in mind as we move forward.
Yeah, I think we need next gen 911, we need to move forward. We're already 5 to 10 years behind technology-wise from what the consumer's expectation of what our capabilities are. We're already, in some form or another, alienating the deaf and hearing impaired community because they've already almost exclusively transitioned to texting as a communication format. And we're communicating with them across traditional legacy TDY equipment, and it's just, we're not being fair to them.
Well, I appreciate it. I'm going to conclude this now. Mr. Torian, again, for you and your staff, thank you so much for everybody. But also, the more you can work with Mr. Torian and your staff on how, us commissioners, how we can be most helpful in making sure the transition is the best way possible.
I just have one question. Do you know what next steps you'd like to take here? I think we've heard a little bit about just some of the underlying technology and architecture, and I don't know if a series of technical workshops would be helpful and useful to understand what it is we're trying to transition from and transition to and what the options are.
Mr. Torian, I think you're about to tell us.
Sure. Can I engage in Aaron too? So I think given the recent filing that Quest made CenturyLink made regarding their tariff, as well as the information that we learned today, that staff and council is prepared to discuss with you what might be the most appropriate next steps, get your thoughts. I'll summarize it this way. I know we will need more input from the various stakeholders on the appropriate way to move forward. Certainly in the petition that the 911 authorities put forward, and Joe's been talking about, there's thoughts about an RFI process as well. So I think, again, if we take what we learned today and we keep in mind the principles and then the fact that we can provide a forum here to work collaboratively, to have information documented, filed, be transparent, and that we will figure out where the commission needs to make decisions, where others need to make decisions, and at the same time be able to get something done. And I think that's going to hopefully take the form of requesting comments from everybody, and then from there establishing, if it's a series of workshops or things that can really advance the ball forward, and hopefully we can get a decision out on that in the next couple of weeks as to what the commission would suggest as a path. I don't know, Erin, if you want to say.
And also just to introduce myself, I'm Erin McLaughlin, Commission Counsel, not just sitting up here. I think that Ms. Notoriani is correct that we have a lot to think about today, and again, the comments here today are give good direction. As far as I know, some workshops were suggested, and there have been some of the RFI process, but then to eventually have a recommendation from advisors and council as far as where the commission should go next in the process would be in the coming weeks.
I don't think it's overstating by telling you that the commission is grateful for the service that you've all provided. Thank you very much, and we are adjourned.